Hello, everyone. I'll provide some quick housekeeping information before we get started with today's session. We know a number of people were unable to attend this time slot, so this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting this and our last 3 webinars on the FEMA website. As we begin, if you're able, we do recommend that you join through the Adobe Connect application rather than the internet browser, as this allows for a better user experience. Audio is being broadcast through your computer speakers, but this meeting also has closed captioning. To use the closed captioning service, please click on the CC in the bar at the top of your screen to select Closed Caption. Getting into the meeting logistics, this webinar will include approximately 50 minutes of presentation, followed by about 25 minutes of questions and answers. Please note, because we have a lot to cover and we want to leave time for those questions, we've muted all the lines and we'll be collecting all questions through the Q&A pod found on the right side of your screen. You can submit a question at any time, and we'll try to get to them all, but if we're unable to get to your question due to the time constraints, then we recommend you reach out to your SHMO, or State Hazard Mitigation Officer. You can find a list of SHMOs in the web links pod, and we also have several downloadable attachments, including today's presentation slides, in the Files for Download pod. You'll find both of these pods in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. At the end of today's session, we'll have some short polling questions for you that we'll bring up on your screen. These are optional, but we welcome your feedback to help improve future webinars. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Howard Stronach, Chief of the Disaster Implementation Branch in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division at FEMA headquarters.
Great, thank you, Alex. And good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Welcome to our 4th and final Spring of 2022 Hazard Mitigation Grant Program webinar on cost estimating. While this is the last of our spring offerings, my colleagues in the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program are planning more webinars in summer, and my team and I are planning more HMGP-related and HMA grant-related offerings in the fall. We'll be sending out notifications when the details of those are finalized, so please stay tuned. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, provides funding to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to mitigate future disaster losses in their communities. HMGP funds a wide range of projects ranging from property acquisition to safe room construction to address and reduce risk associated with natural hazards. My team at headquarters works closely with our regional offices to implement the program. As mentioned, today's session will focus on what is a cost estimate and how it can be developed in a way that contributes to a quality scope of work for FEMA grants and ensures that it meets FEMA's eligibility criteria. Our speakers, Abdullah Ibrahim, Sam Sundaraj, and Brian Wilsey, will help you understand how to do a cost estimate for use in our grant program and the process of determining reasonable costs. As Alex mentioned, if you have any questions during the presentation, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A box at any time. We will answer as many as possible at the end of our session, but we may not be able to get to everyone's questions. We received a lot of interest in this series and been encouraged by your engagement. We hope these webinars have been informative and will help communities, particularly those that have limited exposure to HMGP or who have not participated in the program in the past, better understand how to successfully apply for and implement mitigation projects with HMGP funding. As I mentioned, we are in the process of planning additional webinars for a fall series. At the end of the session, we will ask for your feedback, and if you have topics that you'd like us to cover, please submit them at that time. Thank you again, and let's begin our presentation with Abdullah. And I hand it to you, Abdullah. All yours.
Thanks, Howard. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reviewing Cost Estimates for HMA Grant Applications webinar. Today, we'll be going over basic cost estimating principles and how cost estimates are reviewed under the FEMA Grant Application Program. In this webinar, we are going to cover the basics of construction cost estimate for common project types under Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, provide general understanding of cost estimates review for HMA projects throughout the grant lifecycle, provide a process for determining reasonable cost as part of grant application review. However, this webinar will not cover cost estimates for developing mitigation plans. We will start with an introduction to cost estimation and some guidance on cost estimates review process by FEMA. Then we will review some example cost estimates and open the floor up for questions. If you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So, first I'll try to answer the basic question. What is cost estimating? At the most basic level, cost estimate is an approximation based on best available information of the probable cost of a product, a program, or a project. This statement is loaded, but I will draw the attention to two terms. This is an approximation, this is very important, and it's based on best available information. Each sub-application must contain a detailed construction cost estimate, we call it budget, to support all components of the project scope of work. The HMA guidance provides the requirements for cost estimates submitted with HMA sub-application. A cost estimate should, based on the guidance, should be consistent with the scope of work and schedule. And a cost estimate should include all necessary cost items such as labor, materials, equipment, etc. And the cost estimate should have documentation of source material used to support the cost estimate. Should include enough information for FEMA to determine the costs are reasonable. For additional cost estimate requirements, please refer to HMA guidance provided at FEMA website. Cost estimating is important for an application because it supports the obligation of federal funds and protects taxpayer dollars. A complete cost estimate will complement the scope of work, inform the cost effectiveness analysis, and ensure fairness and consistency throughout the project lifecycle. There are various resources that can be used to develop construction cost estimates. Cost estimating guides are available for purchase, and several trade organizations provide manuals for estimating labor costs. Some examples are listed here on this slide. When considering construction equipment rental rates, you can consult FEMA Public Assistance Schedule for equipment rates and local equipment vendors. Next, we'll go on the most common resources used by cost estimators are RS means, Construction Cost Book, DNI, General Construction Cost Book, and Walker's Building Estimators Reference Book. All of these are available online for purchase. FEMA also provides CEF for Large Projects Instruction Guide. CEF stands for Cost Estimating Format. CEF provides cost estimating guidance for large projects in the Public Assistance Program. CEF is not required for cost estimates under HMA, BRIC, or HMGP, but it's a useful resource for cost estimation. Next, we'll be talking about the location factors. Cost estimates are highly dependent on the location of the work being performed. I think everybody who works in construction understands this very well. Cost indices and location factors can be applied to cost estimates to ensure accuracy of the location of interest. ENR, BNI, and RS means and all cost estimating software and cost books normally provide different cost indices and location factors. Sometimes you will find out that different indices will produce slightly different results. That's fine. As long as supporting documentation is provided, the use of any common cost index is acceptable. There are other factors that can affect a cost estimate. The nature of the project site will have a large impact on the cost estimate. Think of things like features of the land itself. A hilly land is different from a land that's flat. A rocky nature is different from a land filled with mud, and so on. Available utilities which may be impacted by the project, visibility, local access, available services. Sites may also have additional environmental or historic preservation requirements. The accessibility of resources will also have a large impact on the cost estimate. The availability of labor, materials, energy, markets, suppliers, and customers should all be factored into the cost estimate. Social and environmental factors such as local permitting, regulations, and taxation must be considered when preparing a cost estimate. Finally, geographic constraints like weather and climate should be considered as well. I'll give some examples on the location factors. Here we provide a view. This is a typical table you could get from a cost estimate book. On the left, on the columns, and each column here has two values. On the left side, there are the first three digits of a zip code. On the right side, that's the value of the location factor. To help understand this chart, let's take a couple of examples. Take a project that has a national average cost of $100, for example. If you check this schedule here, for a zip code that starts with 010 in Massachusetts, the location factor is 1.03, which means that the same project there might cost $103. That's 3% more than the national average. While if you check zip codes that start with 711 in Louisiana, the location factor is 0.80, which means the same exact project there might cost $80. That's 20% less than the national average. Please note that those values here on this slide are they do not represent current location factors. Those are just examples to illustrate the idea. Now I'll go over eligible costs. When cost estimates are being reviewed, the first thing that will be evaluated is the eligibility of all cost line items. In general, any cost that's required for the implementation of the mitigation project is considered eligible. In this statement, I'm stating that the main eligibility factor is the requirement for the implementation. That has to be demonstrated that this item is required. This includes costs of any engineering, architectural design services, during construction, labor for personnel who work on the project, materials and equipment, etc. Additional eligibility costs include subcontracts, non-construction costs, escalation bonding and permits, project management, and pre-award costs. Few words on pre-award costs. Pre-award costs are costs that are incurred after each MA application period has opened but before the grant is awarded. Pre-award costs may cover BCA development, application development, design development, or EHP data gathering. However, it doesn't cover the preparation of environmental impact statement. That's a big thing. Pre-award cost does not cover implementation costs incurred before the sub-grant is awarded. And pre-award costs are not reimbursed if sub-grant is not awarded. This is very important here. What's ineligible costs? Just like eligible costs, the cost estimate must be reviewed for any ineligible costs. The best way to think about ineligible costs is to evaluate if the cost item is beyond what's required for the implementation of the mitigation project. Examples of ineligible costs include landscaping for ornamentation, irrigation systems, and site remediation of hazardous materials with few exceptions. For additional information about cost estimate and eligible and ineligible items, refer to HMA guidance addendum. For each project type, there is a detailed list of eligible and ineligible lists. In general, cost estimate components, when we are evaluating cost estimates, it's important to keep these estimate components in mind. A good cost estimate will clearly indicate the elements listed here on this slide. Additionally, a good cost estimate narrative covered later in this webinar will include a description of how these components were estimated. Cost estimates are commonly presented as cost line items with the quantities of measurements presented here. Next slide, please. Thank you. Cost estimates are commonly presented as line items with quantities of measurements presented here. While these are the most common, other quantities of measurements can be used. A lump sum in a cost estimate must be analyzed, as we will discuss in the next slide. Per the HMA guidance, lump sum format cost estimates are not eligible and will not be accepted. However, in certain situations, lump sum cost estimates line items may be accepted. So the differentiation here between the entire cost estimate being lump sum or just specific industry standard lump sum line items. Example. The table on the left here is an example of an ineligible lump sum cost estimate. All costs are presented in lump sum format. It's just LS. You look at the 4 line items here, all lump sum item and one total of $10,350,000. This is an example of unacceptable cost estimate. However, if you look at the table on the right, the cost estimate on the right contains some standard lump sum items within the detailed cost estimate. The lump sum items presented here are the industry standards for items such as mobilization, traffic control, and erosion control. More importantly, these lump sum items should be described in the cost estimate narrative, and a detailed description of how they were estimated should be provided. A couple words on accuracy. This is a very important factor to consider when evaluating cost estimates. If a project is in a concept level, it's expected that the cost estimates would be less accurate because of the many uncertainties and less information known about the project that may arise. There's a lot of uncertainties that may come up during the design and construction phases. This would be considered a project in the concept phase will be considered a Class 5 cost estimate as defined by the Associations for the Advancement of Cost Engineering. On the other hand, the most accurate cost estimate will be for projects that are fully designed and ready for construction. This will be considered a Class 1 cost estimate. Generally, applications submitted under HMA fall somewhere between those two extremes, between two classes. For example, phased projects may even be closer to a Class 5 estimate because at the phased project, before even phase 1 starts, you are still more closer to a concept than the actual detailed design. By the end of phase 1, however, a fully developed engineering design will make it possible to get a more accurate estimate closer to a Class 1 and to determine the feasibility of projects for technical standpoint. Because of the limitation of accuracy of cost estimates, contingencies are allowed under FEMA guidelines. Contingency cost is an allowable in the total estimated cost to cover situations that cannot be fully defined when the cost estimate is prepared, but that will likely result in additional eligible costs. However, allowances for major project scope changes, here between 2 quotation marks, unforeseen risk, or extraordinary events may not be included as contingency costs. Those major changes should have their own categories. The recommended total contingency range per FEMA guidance is between 1% and 5%. The maximum allowable is 5%. Finally, A contingency cost should be included as a separate line item in the budget section of a project application and should be based on the nature of the proposed project. That being said, I will hand it over to Sam.
Okay, thank you, Abdullah. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Reviewing the Cost Estimate webinar. And Alex, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, when a cost estimate is reviewed under the HMA program, it must be reviewed for its reasonableness. So what does that really mean, reasonableness? One might say, isn't that subjective? Okay, the following in the slide is actual regulation. The regulation, folks, is one that has been through the full regulation promulgation process and carries the same requirements as the law. Kind of like the black and white speed limit signs that you and I see. If I see a black and white speed limit sign that says 65, I know that that is 65. It's not like the yellow sign that says you might want to take this curve at about 60 miles per hour because it's a winding road, which is more of an advisory speed limit. It's a black and white sign. So these next few slides are verbatim regulation. So let's read them. According to 2 CFR Part 200.404, a cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the cost. The question of reasonableness is particularly important when the non-federal entity is predominantly federally funded. What does the regulation mean when it says the non-federal entity is predominantly federally funded? Well, the FEMA grant is given to a recipient, a designated state agency, a tribe, or a territory. They become the recipients, and then they in turn administer the grant to the project owner. Okay? But the state is a non-federal entity, and typically the project is 75% federally funded, hence predominantly federally funded by a non-federal entity. Okay? Consideration must be given to whether the cost is of a type generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation of the non-federal entity or the proper and efficient performance of the federal award. Here again, sometimes it sounds like a tongue twister, but let's think it through. Okay? Ordinary and necessary for the operation of the non-federal entity. I was working a project in Region 7, a water line designed by the local rural water district's engineer. Okay? They're not too focused. They're just wanting to put a new water line. So they go to the neighbors and they go knock on the door and they say, man, we're needing to put a trench, so we'll be digging up your front yard. And they say, oh, they're all neighborly. Everything is done with a handshake. Okay? Or the proper and efficient performance of the federal award. When you're trying to put that same project in, but now the project is a bigger water line to either supply a fire station or it is to supply an interconnect to an adjacent water line, we look for things like, do you have the proper easement records? You know, do you have any damage clauses? If you go take down a tree in your neighbor's yard, what does that do? So the federal award, the performance of the federal award might take a different level of accuracy and detail. So that is why that regulation is written the way it is. The restraints or requirements imposed by such factors as sound business practice, arm's length bargaining, federal, state, and other laws and regulations in terms and conditions of the federal award. So what's arm's length bargaining? An arm's length transaction refers to a business deal in which buyers and sellers act independently without one party influencing the other. These types of sales assert that both parties act in their own self-interest and are not subject to pressure from the other party. This is very important, folks, because this is what makes for, because it's not just the buyer and the seller, in other words, the project owner and the funder of the project who are involved. There are other entities, contractors, everybody else is involved in it. So this arm's length transaction is very important. The next slide, please, Alex. Okay, the regulation continues. And this again, folks, is verbatim, but it's worth repeating. Market prices for comparable goods or services for the geographic area. Abdullah made that point about 1.03 in New York versus 0.8 in Louisiana for the geographic area. Whether the individuals concerned acted with prudence in the circumstances, considering their responsibilities to the non-federal entity, okay, its employees, blah, 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 okay. Remember that scope of project. If it's a neighborly, within the county kind of a project, the expectations might be one. If federal projects are involved, the expectations might be different. So with prudence, but considering the responsibilities. Whether the non-federal entity significantly deviates from its established practices and policies regarding the incurrence of costs, which may unjustifiably increase the federal awards cost. I gave you an example of the water line, but you also are looking for instances where the local project owner says it's the feds who are paying, so what do we care how economic it is? You don't want that attitude, right? That's arm's length bargaining. Each person wants to make sure that their self-interest is taken care of. Okay, slide 24, please, Abdullah, Alex. Okay, how do I know if a cost is reasonable? Compare it to similar projects, including non-federal projects. What are we talking about? If you've got a list of the local highway department projects that were awarded in the past, look for those projects or look for those and try to make an assumption. If you're looking at an electric line project, look for projects that are in a similar terrain, okay, and see what the cost was. Evaluate using costing resources that Abdullah mentioned. Focus on major cost items. We'll get into that in a couple of slides. Must match the scope of work and schedule. This is very key, okay? Now, the 2015 HMA guidance, which is a policy document, states if a cost estimate is based on a contractor's bid or historic cost from another activity, detailed documentation must be provided. Think of your estimate as wanting to give good information to where the validator, Samsung, sitting in a FEMA office, is able to track your thinking to where then the approval goes very smoothly and very efficient. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. Okay, when starting a cost estimate review, and this is a table of that, it is good practice to start with evaluating the major cost items within the cost estimate. And this, you'll see there are three areas that are underlined. The cost estimate shown here has those three items that each exceed $1 million. And collectively, they represent 66% of the project cost. Okay? So when you see that, you want to look at your scope of work, the schedule, and any drawings or plans that support those items. Okay? Look to see, is 5 acres necessary? Is almost 100,000 cubic yards of excavation? How does that fit in? About 9,000 cubic yards of concrete, where does that fit in? How do they all tie together to form this whole overall mitigation project? Next slide, please, Alex. A clear scope of work is critical for determining the reasonableness of a cost estimate because the two must be consistent. The scope of work must tie into the cost estimate. The sub-applicant must include a description of the activities and anticipated outcomes for FEMA to determine whether the activities are eligible, whether the sub-applicant can complete the activities within the scope of, within the period of performance. This is very important because you get into delays, you could risk getting your funding. That period of performance, you miss that, it's got to go through all kinds of hoops to request variances, which may or may not be granted. So you got to take these awards very seriously. So see that again, that ties back into that estimate. This is not just a neighborly handshake kind of a project. You are accountable for delivering on time. So the scope of work has to match the schedule also to show that the project can come in within the period of performance. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. Okay, we talked about this. The schedule and cost estimate must align the scope of work. It must make sure that the schedule indicates deliverables and key milestones. So the 5 acres, you're probably not going to buy it in piecemeal, but the excavation and the concreting, make sure that they are tracked in a way. If they trigger middle milestones, make sure that they're all tracking together to where any anticipated quarterly usage of federal funds is also shown in that, to where they know when the funds have to be drawn down. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. Okay, this is another key section, folks. This is one that used to be music to my eyes when I used to be reviewing things in region. Okay, a cost estimate narrative, because that really tells me that the project cost estimator has really understood the mitigation project. What are we looking for? It's a thumbnail sketch that documents the overall project scope. It communicates that the estimator knows the project and understands the scope and schedule as it relates to the cost. That's what I'm looking for as a FEMA reviewer. Okay. It also provides a record of all documents that the estimator used to prepare the estimate by referencing them. Okay. Now, it also acts as a source of support if it should come to dispute resolutions. It establishes a realistic baseline for the scope, quantities, and cost, which should eliminate cost overruns. Remember, if you just had $1 million for concrete, whereas if you had it broken down as this so much is for foundation and then so much is for the next step, you're able to track the project a lot better. Facilitates the review and validation of the cost estimate. That's what I was talking about. Okay, the FEMA reviewer will also look at this because there shouldn't be any of these, but if there are ineligible items that are included in the HMA grant sub-application, the FEMA reviewer will be able to pluck them out and say, oops, but these are valid for the project, but not eligible, sorry, for FEMA funding, which is purely mitigation focused, right? And Brian Wilsey, in his one of his examples, will point to some of those things. Okay, slide 29, please. So, what are we talking about? The most important thing to keep in mind when you're reviewing a cost estimate is that you're trying to determine if the cost estimate is reasonable according to the regulation. To do this, it is recommended that you compare the scope of work, schedule, and cost estimate to ensure consistency and verify that nothing is missing. Okay, ask yourself, are industry standards being followed? Are there any large cost estimates that are not sufficiently explained and that might need to be broken down and tied to key milestones? Another recommended practice is to compare the cost estimate to any drawings, plans, or schematics that are provided, because the engineer might have broken them down in a parts list or something. The cost estimate should be based on quantity takeoffs from such plans, and many of the cost items can be verified by evaluating the plan set. And those plan sets really come in as another requirement. Look for it in the HMA guide. It's in Appendix J of Part 4, I believe, which talks about technical feasibility and effective mitigation, because every project that FEMA funds, the project owner has to show that it's technically feasible and that it is really mitigation, which is what sets the foundation for the scope, the cost, and the schedule. So with that, Brian Wilsey, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I'm going to cover the last two sections of the webinar, starting with this section 3, cost estimate examples, where we'll look at some examples that kind of illustrate some of the points made to this point now. Next slide. So we're going to look at 4 different project types: structural elevation, wind retrofits, safe rooms, and a stormwater management system. Next slide. Okay. So the first example is an elevation project. It's for elevation of a property located in the AE zone, which is what's called a numbered flood zone, a 100-year floodplain. And this project includes pre-construction activities, elevating the structure to 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain, also known as the BFE, or base flood elevation, building restoration work, and then grant closeout. So to better assess the cost estimate, the scope of work and schedule for this project are reviewed. And just like both Abdullah and Sam have mentioned previously, it's good to keep the scope, schedule, and budget for the cost estimate all in sync. If any of you have taken the E212 class that FEMA offers on developing HMA applications, that's something they emphasize in that class quite a bit. And in fact, they have a little graphic of an equilateral triangle where all 3 sides are the same length, the same size, everything's in balance, and we want to try and be sure that the cost, the scope, and the schedule are all in alignment. But the schedule here doesn't include final inspection, obtaining a final elevation certificate, and these are items we'd expect to see with a structural elevation project. They're eligible costs in the HMA guidance addendum. You'll see them for elevations, and we would expect to see those. They are part of the elevation project and need that to finalize the project. Next slide. So the cost estimate includes line items such as design plans, permits, relocation of residents, elevating the structure, pouring a new floor slab at a higher elevation, raising the front steps, reconnecting utilities, grant administration and contingencies. The line items are consistent with the scope of work and the schedule, but again, the detailed cost estimate doesn't include costs for final inspection and obtaining that final elevation certificate. Additionally, the sub-applicant doesn't state who created the cost estimate or provides supporting documentation. So the costs appear reasonable with a couple of exceptions. The cost estimate appears to include some items that may not be eligible, such as replacement of the basement finished interior and inflation costs. We'll talk a little bit more about inflation costs later because that's not as clear-cut and dry as it seems about the eligibility of those. But at any rate, a request for information or an RFI should be sent to the sub-applicant to kind of clarify the cost items wherever there's confusion and clarity needed. And if the costs are ineligible for funding, they might be included in the total project cost. However, they just can't be included as eligible FEMA-funded project costs. And again, if you go to the HMA guidance addendum, there's a pretty well-articulated list of eligible costs for elevation projects. And finally, you'll see here on line 15, there's something called Town Grant Administration, which is really a sub-applicant management cost, which is obligated separately. So the management cost application is done separate and apart from the project application, and it shouldn't be included here. Next slide. The next example we have here is a wind retrofit, and for purposes of this example, we're going to make a few assumptions that this is a residential wind retrofit, and in addition, the scenario provides that the dwelling, the subject dwelling here was constructed in 1993, and it had roof upgrades done in 2016, more recently. So the project includes replacement of the windows and the doors, with impact-resistant windows and doors, hardening of the building envelope. But there's no mention made of retrofitting the roof because this is likely covered with the 2016 roof upgrades. To support the scope of work and the technical feasibility, the sub-applicant provided an evaluation report of the structure's hurricane wind vulnerabilities, and that was prepared by a licensed architect engineering firm. So the schedule also It demonstrates the project will be completed in about 20 months' time. So the main activities here include the design, the pre-construction, and the construction. And then you're familiar with wind retrofits. FEMA has a publication, FEMA P804, which provides details on residential wind retrofits. And there are 3 basic gradations of wind retrofits, but first and foremost with all 3 is the roof retrofit. That's the most important part of the wind retrofit, and that's included in all the levels of wind retrofits. The assumption here is, though, because the roof is just upgraded more recently, that it is compliant with P804. Next slide. So the cost estimate was provided by an engineering firm. They also provided the vulnerability assessment for the structure, and therefore they're pretty knowledgeable about the project. The items in the cost estimate are consistent with recommendations of the vulnerability assessment. And so what that vulnerability assessment is doing, it looks at design wind speeds for a given area, the existing type of construction to kind of inform what type of materials and retrofit are required. And this goes directly to the cost estimate. So in this case, because the engineering firm did the vulnerability assessment and also the cost estimate, it instills a little more confidence on the part of the reviewer that they did a pretty good job at developing this estimate. So as expected here, the doors and windows are the largest component cost for the project. And again, the scenario doesn't include the roof because that was upgraded in 2016. Next slide. So the cost estimate includes items such as construction material costs, general conditions and requirements, performance and payment bonds, overhead and profit, builder risk insurance, general liability and contingency, and the items are consistent with the scope of work and the schedule. However, the cost estimate doesn't include that permitting and inspection costs, somewhat similar to the earlier example. So in this example also, the total contingency cost is approximately 14% of the project cost. And as we talked about earlier, this exceeds the recommended 1 to 5% for contingency costs that are in our HMA guidance, and so that would need to be reduced. Can be as high as about 7% in some instances for historical properties, for example. But you kind of have to justify the contingencies also and the level of contingencies you're asking for. Because this project has the vulnerability assessment already included, it's not a separate line item, but if a vulnerability assessment had not yet been conducted, that's a legitimate project cost and would be included here as a separate line item also. Next slide. The previous slides have presented the cost estimate summary page. However, now we'll look at more detailed line items for each component in that summary page. So an example here is in the line item for doors and windows. This line item is further broken down into more detailed costs for demolition and replacement with impact glazing systems. Just generally speaking, the more detailed the better. Just like the scope of work, the schedule and the budget paint the picture about why certain costs are necessary and how they're consistent with that scope and schedule, right? You need to maintain that equilateral triangle. And when you do that, it just gives the reviewer more confidence that the applicant has really thought through the project development and the components needed to complete that project, along with their costs. Next slide. The costs associated with the detailed items for the doors and windows were supported by a vendor quote from a glazing company. Again, these are legitimate, credible sources for the estimates. We're getting estimates from an engineering firm, from a building contractor, from a product manufacturer, but not from my Uncle Joe down the street who did a wind retrofit on his house 20 years ago. That would not be considered a legitimate, credible cost. Okay, next slide. Our next example, we'll look at a generator project. So in this case, the sub-applicant submitted an application for the purchase and installation of an 80 kilowatt diesel emergency generator to provide backup power for a library, a 70 kilowatt diesel emergency generator to provide backup power for a highway garage, and 2 400 amp automatic transfer switches. So the highway garage generator would be fueled by existing fuel tank nearby, but the fuel source for the library generator is unknown. It's not listed. The schedule provided indicates the project will be done in 12 months. However, if you add up the duration in each of the steps here, it adds up to about 21 months. So we've got a little issue there that needs to be resolved. Next slide. Actually, Alex, I'm on slide 40. Okay, so there we go. My slides are not in agreement. One moment. Safe room. Okay. So the cost estimate line items are consistent with the scope of work and the schedule and the engineering design, project manager, special inspection, site work, construction materials. The cost estimate was prepared by an engineering firm, again, credible source for the cost estimate. As previously mentioned, the safe room, it'll be a multi-use safe room, so the costs not directly related to the safe room and safe room function are not eligible for funding. For this reason, the sub-applicant separated out the eligible and ineligible project costs. Generally speaking, for most of our projects, grant funding can be used only for the mitigation purpose of risk reduction. And in the case of safe rooms, more specifically, that translates to the components that are necessary for life safety protection. So eligible safe room costs are listed in the HMA guidance in the addendum, Part C. But the breaking out of eligible and ineligible costs, it's especially critical with community safe room projects, because these are typically multi-use facilities. It's a rec room, a gym, a community center, and so forth. And the overall project costs, therefore, include many ineligible cost items that are separate and apart from the safe room. But if you contrast that with, for example, a drainage improvement or stormwater project, where the vast majority of those project costs are all eligible mitigation components, so they would more be eligible. This is, as I say, more critical for safe room projects where we have multiple uses for that structure. Next slide, please. The construction costs were further broken down into detailed line items. Structural items related to the safe room included the footings, a floor slab, precast concrete walls, concrete roof, the required FEMA 361 rated windows and doors, and those are listed under the architectural components section. As per the FEMA 361 and ICC 500 requirements, ICC is International Code Council 500. That's a publication dealing with safe rooms. They will require backup power, an HVAC system, an appropriate number of restrooms, fire sprinklers, and the like. And these items are shown in the cost estimate in the electrical and mechanical components section. Now, some might argue that these aren't necessarily life safety components, but if you'll be occupying a small space as small as 5 square feet for a tornado community safe room for any length of time, you'll need good ventilation, you'll need restrooms, fire sprinklers at all. So they are indeed eligible costs. The HMA Guidance Addendum, again, Part C, provides a list of eligible and ineligible components of residential and community safe rooms. This section should be referenced when you're reviewing safe room cost estimates. It's a pretty detailed list that we have in the HMA Guidance Addendum. So in our little graphic here on the left, the elements that support those life safety are eligible costs. The ingress and egress, the doors and windows, the generator and the housings surrounding the generator, the walls, the roof, that hard shell that creates the safe room, even food storage. However, as much as I like basketball, things like basketball court and the hoops and the bleachers, the lockers, concession stands, all those are not eligible safe room costs. So our fourth example here is the stormwater management system. In this particular case, the applicant is submitting an application for the installation of a new storm sewer system within the city boundaries. The project includes new stormwater pipes, inlets, manholes, new wastewater sewer lift station, and detention ponds. The project is intended to reduce the risk of street flooding and wastewater sewage backup into homes in the community. The proposed storm sewer systems being sized for the 2-year storm event. Anyone familiar with stormwater management will probably recognize the 2-year storm event as what's generally known as bank full flow conditions, and that's what many stormwater management ordinances around the nation they seek to control. It's kind of control of those smaller flows to alleviate stream bank erosion, and it's not necessarily flood control for large 100-year storm events. But in this scenario, even with these small frequent events, we have storm drain backups. It may be a case where the storm drains were built long ago and they're not of sufficient capacity to pass even smaller storms nowadays. So they're doing some storm drainage upgrades. The schedule here indicates the project is to be done in 25 months. And again, for a stormwater project, we'd expect that there would be a permitting process, and that process is not included specifically in the schedule either. So as we can see from the cost estimate here, the line items in the cost estimate line up with what we'd expect in our reviews from the scope of work. The cost estimate was prepared by the sub-applicant's engineering consultant, and there are multiple line items for different size storm sewer pipes and different costs associated with those. So for example, you'll see a 12-inch storm drain. Its cost is $30 per linear foot versus a 60-inch storm drain, which is $110 per linear foot. As well as the lift station and the detention pond are listed here also. The lift station have a quantity measure of each, or kind of a lump sum. And while this is typically seen for lift stations, detention ponds are typically broken down into multiple line items. So if the cost estimate narrative doesn't sufficiently explain how this item is estimated, again, it's necessary to issue an RFI and get more clarity and more detail on that cost item. So the cost estimate has a lump sum for engineering and administration based on a percentage of the construction cost. And this is also a lump sum cost, and we need more detail provided here. So by way of example, the detention pond, there's a $110,000 cost there. The detention ponds have many subcomponent costs. They include site grading and excavation, erosion and sediment control during the construction, dam and embankment construction, perhaps import of fill material for the dam if you don't have sufficient clay-type soils to construct that embankment, the control structure, or the riser it's called, which controls the outflow from the pond, the barrel, the storm drain pipe that is under the embankment, the outfall, the final site grading and stabilization. There's a whole lot of component costs that go into both the design and the construction of these detention basins, and we just don't have that detail here in this example. Okay, so just a review of the sections that we've gone over. Next slide. We have a cost estimate review checklist. So this checklist should be a guide for you when you're reviewing a cost estimate. The checklist should be used to determine if the project costs are reasonable, as we spoke about earlier. And you should ask yourself a series of questions based on these checklists. Does the job name match what's on the other documents provided in the sub-application? Sometimes multiple projects are being prepared by one jurisdiction or one engineering firm, and strange as it may sound, sometimes projects get crossed and mixed up, and we've got to be sure that everything is consistent with the job name and with the cost estimate provided and so forth. Is the scope of work and schedule fully developed? Is it consistent with the cost estimate? Again, keeping that equilateral triangle in shape. Has the cost estimate narrative been provided to support the cost estimate? And Sam talked about that quite a bit. It just gives further detail to describe the budget line items. It paints that full picture, gives more credibility to the cost estimate. Has a description been provided for each of the individual line items? Again, painting the full picture, making the reviewer understand exactly why those subcomponents are needed and why the costs are what they are. Has a unit measure been provided for each line item? Unit prices and number of units. It just further displays the competence of the person putting together the budget and the cost estimate. Do we include equipment, labor, materials, subcontractor costs, and so forth in the estimate? Are the soft costs included in the estimate? The legal fees, profit, overhead, and so forth. And then finally, just at the very end, the math check. Does it all add up? Does it make sense? So, again, a few reasons for issuing an RFI, and these are pulled from the previous examples. The cost estimate's missing important information mentioned in the previous checklist. That would be a reason to go back for an RFI. Are there inconsistencies between the scope, the schedule, and the cost estimate? You know, for some reason they don't jive, they're not in sync, and we need to reach back to the applicant for further clarification. And then ineligible costs, like the town grant administration, that should be a separate management cost, separate and apart from the project cost. Next slide. Other reasons for reaching back. There are lump sum cost items with no quantities which have not been described in sufficient detail in the cost narrative. Again, we've got these engineering costs at over $750,000 each with no details. We need to see more specifics on how these estimates were derived. The detention pond example, there's a lot of these subcomponent costs that go into building a detention pond and also in the designing of that pond, and we just need more detail on how those costs were derived. Also, regarding the contingency costs, is everything accurate? Are the contingency costs in that 1 to 5% range like we specified in our HMA guidance? The contingency costs, another thing about contingency costs, they're not automatically available to use. You know, the applicant has to demonstrate the need from another direct cost category where we have to apply those contingency costs. And any of these post-award changes to the budget require prior approval. Sometimes we see conflated contingency costs and perhaps inflation costs, and I talked about that early on, the inflation cost factor. But inflation costs really are not legitimate contingency costs. And early on in that structural elevation, indicated that inflation costs were not eligible. So generally speaking, when estimators use these national cost guides, you know, RS Means, Marshall and Swift, BNI, etc., the most current costs are reflected in those guides, and those guides are updated quarterly typically, so they're pretty current. However, you know, it's come to our attention more recently that in today's climate with exceedingly high inflation rates, you know, maybe these cost guides are not up to date and not current enough, or maybe we're estimating costs for items that are not included in a particular cost guide. So we've been looking at our authorizing legislation and regulations concerning costs, you know, and it may be that inflation costs could be listed as a legitimate separate line item as per 2 CFR 200, but generally speaking, you know, the proverbial devil is in the details. You have to include a good cost estimate, good cost narrative, with a description of the line item cost to support that overall cost estimate. So as we talked about earlier, there are allowances for major project scope changes, unforeseen risks, or extraordinary events like the inflation rates we have today, and they can be included, but not as contingency costs, but rather standalone cost items in the budget estimate. Next slide. The multi-use safe room example. They've clearly listed 2 columns here, FEMA eligible, FEMA ineligible. We want to take a good look at those costs. Again, especially for multi-use safe room where there are a lot of ineligible costs in the overall project cost. Or for something like a drainage improvement project, that's less the case. But again, for a safe room where there's multi-uses, we pay for those things that go to the mitigation purpose of life safety protection, and we don't cover floor finishings, basketball courts, hoops, bleachers, and so forth. So that concludes the summary, and now I think we're on to the Q&A. I'll turn it over to Howard.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Abdullah and Sam as well. Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Howard Stronach, Chief of the Disaster Grants Implementation Branch in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division at FEMA headquarters. We're entering the Q&A portion of today's session, and I want to thank you for all the questions we've received thus far. As a quick reminder, we're recording today's webinar, and you can download the presentation slides in the files for download pod. I also want to redirect your attention to the web links pod, where you can find several useful links, including a list of the current state hazard mitigation officers. We're going to try to answer as many questions as possible. We don't have a ton of time left, but we're going to get to as many as we can. But if we don't get to your questions during this session, please reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer, and they should be able to help you and point you in the right direction. Now I'd like to ask speakers to join me, and we'll get the conversation started and, again, try to answer as many questions as we possibly can in the next 20 minutes or so. All right, thanks, Sam. Good to see you. Abdullah's joining. All right, and bear with us for a second as we try to pull up the questions that we received. See Brian. Abdullah's still spinning, the circle's spinning, but so we'll give him a second. Come on, hopefully his camera will start working. All right, I'm gonna, what I can do here to pull up questions. All right.
Yeah, we can go ahead and start with the question. Looks like my camera is not coming on for some reason.
Yeah, that sounds good, Abdullah. Thank you. All right. Let's see. All right. Question number one is for you. Oh, before we get into all of the sort of specific questions, I did see some general questions about procurement. Obviously, that affects the reasonableness of costs, and how and whether or not FEMA is going to determine if cost is reasonable. All contracts should be competitively procured with relation to HMA grants, and so you need to ensure that if you're a local community, that you're following your local procurement requirements, state procurement requirements, and also federal procurement requirements. In terms of the federal procurement requirements, there's some great resources that FEMA has online from our procurement disaster assistance team. You go to FEMA.gov and you just do a search on procurement disaster assistance team. There's a lot of great information and resources available there to help particularly local officials understand what the federal requirements are and how to navigate those and how to ensure that you comply with them. That is critically important in terms of following the federal guidelines required for procuring your contracts. So I highly recommend anyone who's got questions about any of those requirements to check out those resources, and there's training included there as well. Again, it's the Procurement Disaster Assistance Team information on FEMA.gov. But with that, we'll go to the first question. This one I'm going to point to you, Abdullah. It's very straightforward. How can I develop a cost estimate?
Thanks, Howard. There are a number of ways to develop a cost estimate. First step is to clearly identify the scope of project. This is a very, very important, and that's the major step, I would say. Unless you know exactly what you are going to do, then the cost estimate may be meaningless. So you need to include in the scope of work all the items needed to implement the project. For larger projects or more complex projects, you might need a vendor cost, community engineering, or public works departments, or contractor support by maybe a part of assembling comprehensive cost estimate. For smaller projects, such as acquisition of a home, a fair market value, and the estimated time spent managing the project. There are 2 points here. I'm going to comment on these as well. Basically, you need a fair market value and estimated time spending managing the project. Maybe that's all what you need. In all cases, documenting the source of estimate, assumptions made, and avoiding lump sum costs are important for assembling a complete and appropriate estimate. When we're talking about fair market value, and this is a very general, a very common mistake happen for people who use building replacement value in the BCA tool as a fair market value. And just to point out, a fair market value is totally different value from the building replacement value. A fair market value is more connected to an appraisal. A replacement value means more like it sounds, you want to replace and build a new building, and that might be totally different value. And the time of managing the project, I want to raise another point here. Project management cost is different from grant management cost. A project management cost, it goes in the cost estimate, is an eligible item. Grant management cost, subrecipient or recipient management cost, doesn't go to the cost estimate. This comes from totally different funds and has nothing to do with the project management cost itself. I think with this, I will end this question.
Thanks, Abdullah. Really appreciate that. I think we'll unpack a little bit more of what you stated there in some of these follow-on questions as well. So another question for you, Brian. What are the resources that FEMA has available to help prepare a cost estimate?
So FEMA doesn't have specific resources to prepare cost estimates for mitigation projects, but depending on the project type, there's a number of non-FEMA resources out there that can help you prepare a cost estimate. You know, if a project is fairly straightforward, for example, a structure elevation, you might be able to obtain vendor quotes for the entire project. Vendor or contractor has done that project previously. Alternatively, if the project is similar to something a community's Department of Public Works might perform, they might have prior similar projects that are representative of the work to be done, and you could get cost estimates there. And also the cost estimating guides. There are a number of guides out there that can be used to identify the cost of unit of work. You know, for example, excavating a cubic yard of material or installing a linear foot of storm drain pipe. They can be referenced and used, and they're credible, reasonable, defensible cost estimate components. So as projects get more complex, the cost estimates become more detailed, and community engineering department, if it exists, might be needed for an engineering firm to develop a sufficient detail on the cost estimate, particularly for phased projects, you know, those complex projects that require a fair amount of engineering and design. These costs can be part of the project, and if a project is phased, we'd expect the cost estimate to kind of evolve as the project gets designed.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, as Brian mentioned, you know, we don't have a specific guide for hazard mitigation projects on cost estimating. Brian did reference earlier in the presentation PA, the Public Assistance Program's cost estimating format. And there is a guide there that CEF publication provides, I think, a good resource in terms of the process for developing a cost estimate and factors to consider when developing one. So that is a resource that you could refer to and would be helpful in developing, I think, any construction-related cost estimate. Right. Thanks again, Brian. Stan, I have a question on cost reasonableness for you. How do I know if a cost estimate is reasonable?
Okay. As we saw on the slide, the starting point, of course, would be to look at the regulation itself. And you don't have to go looking at for the regulation. It's there in the slide deck verbatim, as I said. But there are a wide range of items that can be in a cost estimate. So understanding all the items and if each cost is reasonable can be a challenge. In reviewing an estimate, the best practice is to focus, as we alluded again in the slide deck, on the big ticket items. Okay, remember the $1 million cost items. Okay, and then look for things like, does the cubic yards of material, does the cost per cubic yard sound reasonable to you? You know, we had like 100,000 cubic yards of concrete. So if a safe room has a significant cost per concrete, look to see does that unit cost seem reasonable before you check the overall estimate. And also remember that you want your costs to be reasonable, because if the costs are overestimated, you are cheating somebody else of a valid project, because the HMA grants do have a cap on them. And these are reimbursement projects. So if your project was overestimated, it will still only be reimbursed at the actual cost. If you leave money on the table, that's lost to the state. So you want to make sure that your cost is reasonable within reason.
Thanks, Sam. And I think as Brian was mentioning earlier, you can look at historic costs, for similar work. You can look at costs from other localities, maybe near your jurisdiction, for similar work as guides to whether or not the costs you're getting from vendors or contractors are reasonable. It's important to understand, though, I think that every contract is a little different. So the contract costs for that you got in the past might be lower than what you're experiencing now due to inflation, for example. But the market conditions might be different. The geographic conditions or the site conditions might be different. Size of the procurement might be different. And the variations in the scope of work might cause, differences in the cost. So I just wanted to point that out, that historic costs or costs from other jurisdictions nearby could be helpful guides for understanding if what you're looking at is reasonable, but you have to understand that there may be variables associated with them that are different from the work you're looking at performing. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at historic or other jurisdictions' costs. All right.
I like to expand on this point, Howard.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Abdul, please.
Okay, I mentioned, I did specifically mention about the location factor. That's why we at FEMA, we take a big caution when comparing prices from different areas, because each site has its own factors, and cost might vary incredibly for the same exact product between a location and location, from zip code to zip code, or even from a town to a town. This is number one. But the point I want to raise here, that the cost estimate is not the final price that the sub-applicant will get. This is a cost estimate. As I insisted on the first slide, almost first or second slide, this is an approximation. We know, everybody understands in the grant business or in the construction industry that you cannot have 100%. It's close to impossible to get 100% accurate estimate. So with this being in mind, you will need to understand that reimbursement is based on the actual cost, not on your estimate. You want to make sure your estimate doesn't cut you short. If your project is going to cost you between $100,000 and $120,000, then your estimate should cover the upper range if there is this kind of uncertainty. But the final reimbursement will be on the actual price paid. This is a very important concept, so people don't mix up. That doesn't mean if you pump your estimate a little bit, then you get more money. Not necessarily. It's just to cover your bases and make sure, instead of going and applying for amendment, changing the cost or major changes, this will delay the entire process and increase the bureaucracy in the process. Instead of this, make sure you have a good estimate that covers your bases, that when you go and implement the project, you are 100% covered, and then your actual payments with receipt will be reimbursed. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdullah. Really good information there. I think this next question is kind of a little bit of a follow-up on that one. I'm pretty sure you or Brian, or maybe both, covered this in the presentation, but Just want to make sure we cover it again. Can your estimate include lump sum costs?
Well, if an estimate is solely based on lump sum cost, I did mention this, that's not acceptable per FEMA standard. However, some line items could be lump sum, and those have to be justified. If the main justification will be if they are very common to know as industry standard. And how you recognize industry standards, for example, an engineering cost for an elevation project might be accepted as lump sum item, but engineering cost for an infrastructure project won't be accepted. It's the same thing. It's called engineering, but engineering that's going to go in the cost of a significant amount of money. It's going to take significant stages in terms of design, management, and all that thing cannot be just lump sum in one single item. That's the main difference. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thanks, Abdullah. All right. Okay, we got some questions about whether or not we have example cost estimates that we can share. And do you want to take a stab at that one? I think you might be on mute.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Examples of cost estimates. Examples that we've seen is where they say, where the estimator comes in and says, we've done 5 other such projects for our client, this utility, for so many miles of conductors in similar terrain. And so we were able to, that almost came in as a fairly lump sum project. But then again, like Abdullah said, when they say it will be based on RUS standards and we will, it will be reimbursed accordingly, I think we were able to accept those standards. So in those examples, and then we've also seen in the state of Kansas, the Kansas Department of Transportation's, their information is public as to what the cost came in for state highway roads, which might give you an idea as to how much the cost of materials is, which people are able to use. But I think a comment also, when you use those examples, I think a comment that was made in our Q&A chats is very appropriate, because the federal requirements, and I don't know how to say this because this is not a negative, folks. It is not a negative. People view it as a negative. The environmental and historic factors that had to be factored in. Every dollar that you and I spend, which is a federal dollar, has to show that it's accounted for that. That is not burdensome. That is the law. And if you engage quickly, you are able to meaningfully factor those then into your projects. But those factors might not apply to a private project. An example, I want to go in and repaint my house. If it's 6 years old, I might be able to go do it. Whereas if I have to do it in a county courthouse, I have to account for it's more than 50 years old. Am I affecting something? Coordinate quickly. And it's a process. It is not rigid requirements. So, but you do have to pay for that process, as Abdullah said. That will be a project cost, but you do have to include into the examples of the cost estimates that you might get from your local county or township.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think it's important. I think one of the things you said earlier in terms of, the State Department of Transportation may have, good examples of, roadway type projects, culverts and such, related mitigation projects that can be leveraged to develop cost estimates. And as you mentioned, I think it's a good point. Yeah, we did get a comment in the chat about it. The state, federal requirements, may add cost factors that, you don't see on private construction work. So there's permitting costs, and also the factors associated with market conditions for a publicly funded project versus a privately funded project, that can cause some variation. So those are some factors to consider when you're looking at the costs for a particular project and what you're getting in terms of bids from contractors. All right. Thanks, Sam. All right. Brian, I think there's always questions about, I think we do a pretty good job of saying what is eligible for HMA funding and those costs, and that's pretty broad. But what are some of the costs that we want to make sure folks understand are clearly not eligible when they're building a cost estimate? I think you're on mute, Brian.
Thank you, Howard. Yes, the HMA guidance provides details on what are ineligible and eligible costs. And the HMA guidance addendum in particular for specific project types such as safe rooms, elevations, mitigation reconstruction, wildfire. In the addendum, we list a half a dozen or more project types, and we articulate in pretty good detail what are eligible and ineligible costs for each of those projects. But generally speaking, if the cost isn't required to implement the mitigation project, it doesn't go to the mitigation value, it doesn't directly relate to the risk reduction, then it may not be eligible. Examples of that might be, doing landscaping beyond what's needed to implement a project to restore the site. Just superfluous things that don't directly go to the mitigation purpose of the project. In addition to that, so any costs for the implementation, actual groundbreaking, are not eligible if they are incurred prior to the award. So starting work before the award might jeopardize the eligibility of the project. So why is that? Sam mentioned them, like EHP regulations, for instance. We can't do groundbreaking and altering buildings before we have an award because we might run afoul of environmental and historic preservation regs. So that's an important point to remember. On the flip side, there are costs incurred after the declaration date for HMGP that might be eligible. They're considered pre-award costs. Those are things like doing an H&H study or gathering EHP data or something like that, but not actual groundbreaking, not actual physical alterations in the field. But those things can be eligible pre-award costs, and they should be listed in your cost estimate as separate line items.
Great, thanks, Brian. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll close up. And I'd like everyone to stay on if possible to participate in our poll, but we'll go one more question for Abdullah. So we got a question about the fair market value for acquisition projects. What should folks look for regarding that, Abdullah?
Yeah, the very simple answer is the best value you can get is an appraisal value. It's from a licensed appraiser. That will give you the most accurate fair market value. This is the best one. If there is nothing like this available, which is, I think it's available nationwide, if this is very difficult to obtain, because the appraisal, let me just back up a little. The appraisal gives you the current condition, the price based on the current condition, location, and the actual value of the property you are trying to do the acquisition project on. So if this is hard to obtain, then probably similar project. The point is you will be covering, again, I like to go always to the basics. You need to be covering your backup. When you are implementing the project, you need to make sure you have enough budget, but not excessive budget, so will render your application inacceptable or ineligible. You want to make sure you have a reasonable price. A reasonable price means whatever represents the actual market, and the best approach is having an appraisal. If this is not available, then probably neighboring, within the neighborhood, within similar houses or similar properties that as close as possible would give you more reasonable price. It won't be as accurate as an appraisal, but will be better than nothing. Thanks.
Thanks, Abdullah. Appreciate it, everyone. All right. That's going to wrap up our Q&A portion of the session. Again, I wanted to ask everyone to hang on the line if you wouldn't mind and answer a few poll questions. But I want to thank everyone for participating, and we hope this has been useful. You should now be seeing those polling questions on your screen. If you have time, we welcome you to take a minute to leave us with some of your feedback. This should only take a few minutes and helps us improve our webinars and inform the topics of future series. So thank you again for taking the time to listen and ask questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. But if you have any questions that were unanswered, please reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer